All right, everybody, we're going to finish out this chapter on welfare policy. We're going to begin here with slide number 49, okay? And I've kind of interjected some of this material, but I think it's important for us to at least look at it, because as we're talking about welfare policy, invariably we get into the issue of socialism, okay? And what is it? And so I just thought it would be important for us just to take a few segments here, just to talk about kind of the pros and cons of socialism, because it's becoming a big deal with many of these candidates that are emerging, in particular on the Democratic side, of the more hard left candidates arising, individuals like Bernie Sanders, individuals like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and others. In fact, many on the Democratic ticket in the 2020 election, okay, before Biden emerged as the front runner, were also advocates of socialism. So I think it's just important to understand a little bit about what it is and kind of, again, the pros and cons. So if you look on slide number 49, you can see there, socialism, what is it, the definition, okay? So what socialism is simply the government regulation of or outright ownership of the means of production and the distribution of goods and services for the common good of all. Okay, this idea that government ownership of sectors of the economy. Okay, a good example of socialism that's actually occurring within the federal government in your generation, okay, would be Obamacare. Okay, so when during Obama's presidency and the Democratic legislature voted on it, and it was signed into law by President Obama in 2010, I believe, 2010, 2011. But basically, 1/6 of the U.S. economy was suddenly nationalized. Okay, in other words, 1/6 of the economy was the healthcare industry. So suddenly 1/6 of it was now controlled by the government. Okay, that is an example of socialism. Okay, and the logic, again, with Obamacare was this idea that, hey, there are some people that aren't getting good healthcare for some odd reason and or can't afford good healthcare policies and something to that extent. And this idea is if everyone kind of pays into a common pool, some people are going to get a benefit that they didn't have before, okay? And there was all kinds of taxation strategies and different things like that. But that would be an example of socialism that is actually taking place in your generation, okay? Okay, so that's the first portion of the definition. The second one would be this, the redistribution of wealth in keeping with left-wing ideals of social justice and equality, okay? In other words, part of the logic that socialism employs today, and proponents of socialism, politicians in particular, is this idea it's not socially just for certain sectors of the economy, certain businesses, certain individuals to make a lot more money than everyone else does. And there's this huge wealth gap between those that are very, very wealthy and those that aren't. And so it's socially just. It's an aspect of equality to take from one group of people and give to another. Again, contrast that with, James Madison's essay on property, which he said that is not the policy of the United States government. Okay, it's very different in logic today. It's actually an intentional repudiation of Madison. Okay, so let's talk about arguments for socialism. Okay, if you go to slide number 50, you'll see some of the arguments. Okay, one of the arguments for socialism is a capitalistic free enterprise system is wasteful and dangerous. Okay, in other words, the argument goes something like this: the capitalistic system, all of this technology, all of these factories, okay, all of these businesses, all of these consumers, okay, it exploits nature and natural resources for the benefit of a few. Okay, again, the common argument is, hey, Jeff Bezos, owner of Amazon, the guy makes, he's pushing $200 billion. That's what he's worth. What gives? Why isn't he paying as much taxes? Why isn't he paying his employees a lot more money? Okay, in other words, that's the argument for socialism, okay? Because they point to someone like that and say, listen, the government needs to step in and rectify the system. A second argument for socialism is this, is that government should regulate or nationalize key industries, okay? Again, in the interest of social justice and for the common good. Okay, one of the arguments for Obamacare was it's just not socially just that some people cannot pay for health care. Okay, so the government must step in. But again, when it does that, it extracts taxes from certain groups of people to subsidize the lower cost of healthcare to certain other sectors of the economy. Okay. The third argument for socialism is this, is that a more just and equitable redistribution of wealth can be effected through government taxation policies and social welfare. Okay, in other words, if the government steps in, it can equalize the playing field so that the rich pay their fair share. Okay, so goes the argument. A fourth argument for socialism is that the ideal society is an equalitarian society in which no one has more or less than what they actually need. Okay, so in the interest of social justice, the gap between the rich and the poor should be closed. Okay, so in other words, you should take someone like a Jeff Bezos, you should take some very, very wealthy company that's not paying enough taxes and force them to pay more taxes so that supposedly closes this income gap, or so goes the argument. Okay. Number 5. Priority in government policies and programs should be to promote the collective welfare of society rather than individual rights and personal autonomy. Okay, whereas the founders were very much, advocates of individual rights, one of which is your right to your property. In other words, you deserve what you made. Nobody else deserves that because you worked hard and you earned it. Socialism cuts against the grain of that, and they say that, listen, your rights are not individual, they're collective. And so perhaps you need to sacrifice for the common good so we can all be equal. Okay, or so goes the logic. Number 6, government and cultural institutions and individuals should support policies and programs that encourage social cooperation rather than competition. Okay, cooperation over competition. Okay, so anyway, these are some of the arguments for socialism. Okay, here are some of the arguments against socialism. Again, what would be great is if we actually had a class that we were, together, we could kind of talk about these, and I'm sure some of you have your own input on some of these pros and cons. So here's some arguments against socialism. Okay, first of all, it's utopian. Okay, to this idea that we're going to have a perfect society if everyone is equal in the amount of money they make, and we're all going to live happily ever after. Okay, it's an unrealistic view of human nature. Okay, so according to socialism, humankind is naturally good, generous, cooperative, and civic-minded. And if we're liberated from our antiquated and oppressive social, political, religious systems, the goodness inside of us will manifest itself. Okay, it's very utopian. Okay, it thinks that everything's going to be a perfect world if everything is equal in the area of financial resources. Okay, another argument against socialism is that socialism has a very simplistic view of social and economic history. Okay, democratic socialists, like the more radical Marxist socialists, think that wealth is acquired either through unearned inheritance or by devious means. In other words, the workers are exploited. That's how people get rich. That is how someone like a Jeff Bezos, okay, or that is someone like a Bill Gates gets rich. They've exploited somebody, and so that's why they have their wealth, okay? And so they idealize and they make the poor innocent victims of an unjust social order. And so the only way to solve it is some form of government intervention, okay? So the argument is that's overly simplistic. Life does not necessarily work that way. There actually are some people who are poor because they have no initiative and they don't try, they don't work. That's why they don't have a lot of money, not because the system is rigged, okay? Third argument against socialism, okay? Socialism puts the economic cart before the horse, okay? So there's two major components of an economic system, okay? The one is the production of wealth, okay? The creation of goods and services, inventing things, building things, okay? And then the distribution of goods and services, okay? The production of goods and services and the distribution of goods and services, okay? And so obviously you have to have a priority on production, because if you don't place a priority on production, you have nothing to distribute, right? You've got to have something in the pipeline, okay? And so any government policies that punish or disparage productivity, the creation of wealth, ultimately becomes counterproductive, okay? Because you don't have any more product to distribute if you keep punishing the producers, okay? That's the argument against socialism. Another argument against socialism. Socialized, centralized planning doesn't work, Okay, history has shown that government bureaucrats, often far removed from the intricate and subtle market forces that operate at a local level, tend to be out of touch with the realities of market pricing, okay, and supply and demand. Reliable information simply cannot be collected, analyzed, and processed by a centralized bureaucratic agency and used to efficiently make the economy work, okay? Exhibit A, the Soviet Union. From the 1920s to the 1980s. Okay, they tried to do it and it didn't work. In fact, their entire economic system ended up collapsing, which is one of the reasons why we have the end of the Cold War. Okay, another argument against socialism is that socialism promotes irresponsibility and dependency. It creates irresponsible people that are dependent upon the government. Okay, in other words, over time it fosters an entitlement mentality. Okay, where people come to depend on the government for things that they would provide for themselves. And if you remember earlier in this class, we looked at the section of Alexis de Tocqueville's Democracy in America, where it's called soft despotism. And if you remember the quote from that, and again, he basically said the central government would be like the authority of a parent. If, like that authority, its object was to prepare men for manhood, but it would seek, on the contrary, to keep them in perpetual childhood. Okay, a citizenry that continually has to look to the government to supply all their needs and wants will in fact be rendered the mentality of a child, is that they're not able to take care of themselves. They're always going to be dependent on somebody else. Okay, and then finally, the final argument against socialism is that it, because it promotes social justice, it is actually antithetical to personal liberty, okay? So despite all of its grandiose moral claims, socialism depends on the coercive power of the state to implement its agenda. In other words, the state has to force people to give more money to the state to redistribute to other people, okay? That's this idea of coercive power, okay? And they use that to siphon off the incomes of productive people and redistribute wealth and buy the support of those who are idle, okay? Again, you can see where socialism can be really popular politically. If you don't have a lot of money, if you don't have a lot of resources, and if you vote for this particular politician that's going to basically pull the levers of the state to redistribute wealth to you, you can see where they could pander a lot of support. So anyway, these are the pros and the cons of socialism. And again, if we were in a class, we would discuss some of this, but I'll leave it to you to decide which is the better, okay? Which is the better system. But it's coming to the forefront. And, the challenge, again, with socialism is you can keep redistributing. And again, if you saw some of the previous lectures where I showed you the national debt, okay, we're approaching, as I record this, pushing $28 trillion worth of debt as I record this late November of 2020. Sooner or later, the federal government's not going to have money to keep these entitlement programs up. So it's a very problematic issue. Okay. Tell you what, I'm going to stop there. I'm going to do one more video because to break this thing up. We're going to begin with slide number 59.